Hello, pre-service teachers. I wanted to take a second to welcome you to this course. Unfortunately, we cannot meet in person this first week since I do have Meet the Teacher night, but we can still talk a little bit and we'll go through Chapter 1 through this video PowerPoint. And then next week, I'll be able to tell you a little bit more about myself. We'll do a little bit more of an introductory thing and then we'll continue on with our learning. But I do want to welcome you and I look forward to getting to know you all this semester. Because we are fully asynchronous this week, I wanted to take a second just to go over the tasks and the expectations for the week. One thing that I'll do every week throughout the semester is on Monday morning, I'll send out an email that has a list of tasks or just other things that we should be thinking about for the week. And that way, when we're not in class, you know what you should be working on or what you need to do to get ready. Since our class is on Thursdays this semester, I know that's towards the end of the week, and so you'll probably want to do some things before class just so that you stay in a good rhythm with all of your assignments and things. So for this week, week 1, there is an introductory discussion board that I would like you to complete. Just generally with our discussion boards, they will always open on Mondays by 9 a.m. You are required to have an initial post, and that should be posted by Thursdays at 11:59 p.m. So that's the day of our class. I'll do my best to remind you about your initial posts when I see you on Thursday nights. And then by Sunday at 11:59 p.m., you need to respond to 2 of your peers' posts. Just one comment is fine, a couple sentences. You're welcome and encouraged to continue dialoguing if you feel that's necessary. But after that comment, those 2 comments, you don't really have to do too much beyond that. So that's what I will be looking for with discussion boards. We won't have one every week. We will have them, I would say, maybe about half the weeks of the semester. But again, that's kind of the timeline for how they'll open. So they open on Mondays, initial post due on Thursdays, and then 2 comments or responses to peers due on Sundays. Another assignment that I want you to be working on this week is called the Professional Growth Worksheet. One thing we're going to talk about at the end of this PowerPoint for Chapter 1 is how we can continue to grow as professionals in the teaching world. And part of that is to reflect. And so the purpose of this professional growth worksheet is just to allow you to reflect on your experiences so far in the education program, with your field experiences, writing lesson plans, things like that. So that's going to be due September 5th, which is the next time, oh, it's actually the first time we'll meet in person. That's due at 6 p.m. If you look at week 1, the week 1 module in Canvas, you will see that assignment there. There's a Word document. Just go ahead and click on that and you can type right into it. And then I do want you, though, to upload your worksheet to Canvas as a PDF. So just go ahead and export that Word document to a PDF and then upload it by September 5th at 6 p.m., which is the start of class. And then the last thing you need to do for this week is to complete the Chapter 1 quiz. This is going to be due Sunday, September 1st at 11:59 p.m. The purpose of this quiz is just to make sure that you watched the video and that you read the textbook. Anytime we have to do a video lesson instead of meeting in class, or if we can't cover that material in class because we're taking a test, you will take a quiz after that just to make sure that you understood what you were supposed to. You are allowed to use the textbook and any notes that you took while watching the video while you take that quiz. One more business thing before we dive into the text, Chapter 1 of the text. The book you see on the screen, that's the cover of the textbook that you are required to have for this course. So it's the 11th edition, Elementary and Middle School Mathematics Teaching Developmentally. There are older versions of the text. I do ask that you have the newest version, which is the 11th edition. There are just some slight differences between the different editions. And additionally, you are required to have the e-text version of the book. The print version is totally optional. So you will see on Slingshot both ISBN numbers. The one you are required to have is the e-text. The print version ISBN is there just in case you want to also get the print version, but only the e-text is required. The print version is totally optional. So now, in the first chapter, we are going to be looking at developing confident and competent mathematics learners. And as we start, just posing a question to you, we might ask sometimes, well, what's the most important factor in a student's learning of math? And arguably, I would say it's the teacher. And I think something we all desire for our students is that, of course, we want them to understand the content, but more importantly, we want them to feel confident and competent in mathematics. And so this chapter, it begins to set the vision for how we teach math effectively. There are three key tools that impact your teaching success in math. First is your knowledge of mathematics, right? So content knowledge. Second is how you teach it. So kind of leans more towards pedagogy. And then lastly is how to focus on each learner. Throughout the course, we hope to hone in on all three of those skills through different activities and discussions. You might have noticed on the cover of your textbook that at the bottom it says teaching developmentally. And you might be wondering what that means. And so teaching developmentally really means that we meet people, our students, where they are at, and we do what we can to address misconceptions and negative feelings about mathematics. If you reflect for a second and if you're honest with yourself, a lot of you may have either felt yourself or heard someone say, I'm not a math person. I'm not good at math. I could never do math. Uh, Maybe it's I can't calculate a tip at a restaurant. I really hope they have those suggested tip amounts at the bottom of the receipt, different things like that. But generally, a lot of people today, from children even through adults, have a negative perception or a negative experience of mathematics. And what we need to do is we need to change that attitude. And we're going to do that by positioning math into more of a positive experience for all students. To do that, there are three essential beliefs that we need to internalize and to promote amongst our students to counter those negative feelings about math. And those beliefs are what you see on the screen here. So we need to help our students believe that mathematics is important, that it's not just something they'll do in the classroom, but it's a part of everyday life. We also need to help our students believe that mathematics is about effort, that it's not genetics or different myths that they may have heard in the past. And lastly, they need to internalize the fact that math is focused on using a strengths based approach. And we will look at each of these factors here now. So the first of the three beliefs from the previous slide is that math is important. And I wanted to share this quote with you here in red on the screen that says, as information becomes ever more quantitative and as society relies increasingly on computers and the data they produce, an innumerate citizen is as vulnerable as the illiterate peasant of Gutenberg's time. And that's by Lynn Arthur Steen. So just a little bit of background. So if you don't know who Gutenberg is, Gutenberg, he was a craftsman. He lived during the 14th century, and he actually invented the printing press. And a cool fact about that is he actually printed the first Bible. But the significance of this quote and why Steen brings up Gutenberg is that at that time, literacy was what distinguished those with upward mobility during the Renaissance. And the ability to read and write protected individuals from being taken advantage of. And so if you were able to read and write, that was really a great skill, a great asset. But if you were not able to read or write, if you were illiterate, then that really posed a huge burden, a huge disadvantage to those types of people. And so what Steen is doing in this quote is she's comparing the ability of people to do mathematics in this day and age to the ability of people to read and write in the 14th century. And so you see that word enumerate there in the second line. And that means somebody who is unable to understand and do basic mathematics. And so ultimately, students need to think math like they do reading, right? We know we need to read to survive, to function in the world. But as our world becomes more mathematical and technological, students need to be able to construct, to modify, communicate, or even integrate new math-related information. This is especially critical with a couple examples like when you're investing or taking out a loan or setting up a budget. And those are things that all of us need to do as adults, regardless of what field or career we enter. And so the goal for us is for math to come as naturally as reading does. And things that cater into that are things like decimals and ratios. And those are getting as crucial now as the understanding of nouns and verbs. And so here, the key purposes for early childhood, elementary, and middle school students learning mathematics is that they should develop deep mathematical understanding as confident and capable learners. They need to understand and critique the world through mathematics. And this last point I really love is to experience the wonder, joy, and beauty of mathematics. And I think our negative experiences with math kind of shades us from seeing the wonder, joy, and beauty of mathematics. One quote that I really love is from Galileo, and he said, "Mathematics is the language with which God wrote the universe." And I think it's true. And there are lots of examples of math in nature. And I think it really communicates the beauty of God, right? Like the number of petals on a rose, different things like that. And so these are things that we have to keep in mind and to emphasize to help our students understand that math really is important, and it's gaining importance as we move forward in the world today. The second core belief now is that mathematics is about effort, not genetics and other myths. And so here on the slide, there are a couple different myths that are presented that I think are pretty common that people believe. The myth number one is that math is inherited. A lot of people might think this. You might feel this currently. You might have felt this in the past. But again, I think I've heard many people say that, oh, I'm just not a math person, right? Or, oh, my child's not a math person. My husband's not a math person. My wife's not a math person, whatever it is. But this thought or this belief is false. Anyone can learn mathematics. And at the heart of it, mathematics, if you think about just breaking down the word, right, biology is like the study of living creatures, living beings, right? Mathematics is the science of patterns. And just in the way that God created us, we inherently are all capable of observing patterns in day to day life. And so, based on that, everybody was born with the ability to do math. It's just something we have to enkindle in our students. The second myth is that learning mathematics is about speed and memorizing facts and procedures. This I can see where this myth comes from, just because of, you might again think back to elementary school, having to memorize the multiplication tables and having to do time tests, things like that. And that stuff is certainly important, and it's certainly things that we should go over with our students. But this is also a false myth, because really the heart of mathematics is mathematical thinking, and it's not about being fast, right? Sometimes we do value speed, but oftentimes some of like the world's most complicated math problems have taken mathematicians years to solve. And I mean years, like 10 to 15 years. Some of these problems still aren't solved, and people have been working on them for a long time. And so it's really not always about producing things fast, but again, it's really about the way that you think. Uh, and really, mathematics is a collective, interconnected whole, and not just a series of isolated skills. All right, and the last myth is that there's just one way to solve a problem. And I think we think this on an individual level a lot, right? Like if we don't understand something the way the teacher's teaching it, then we think, oh, I'm just not going to get it because that's the only way to do it. This, of course, is also false. It's almost never the case. For one example, like the one above, if you think about the problem 29 plus 33, there are numerous ways to solve it, right? Some of you might be thinking right now, if you had some paper, right, lining up 29 and 33, adding the ones, how you were taught in elementary school. But there are other ways to think about this as well, right? Like if I look at 29 and 33 and I use tens and ones, I could think, well, 20 plus 30 is 50, 9 plus 3 is 12, 50 plus 12 is 62. So there are other ways to look at these problems. And this is something that you are going to hear a lot this semester, just looking at different ways to solve problems and then encouraging your students to come up with their own ways as well, and just being able to accept all of those as different ways that are good. Now, the third key belief that we need to adopt in our own thinking is that mathematics should be taught using a strengths-based approach. And again, just to offer you a quote in red here at the top, it says, "Some students are conditioned to see themselves as the dust of the mathematical universe and see others as the stars." And I think where this comes from is if you are one of those students, or if you have a student that thinks, oh, I'm just not good at math, I'm not a math person, right? Then they downplay themselves and they see themselves as dust, as we see in the quote, right? And then they see these kids that are good at math as the stars. And so this, I think it's really getting on to this idea of that some people think it's all or nothing, right? It's like I'm either good at math or I'm not good at math. But what we need to start pointing out and what this strengths based approach means is that we need to recognize mathematical strengths in our students apart from just producing the correct answer. And that might be something like knowing how to set up a problem or being able to think the correct way to start a problem. We also need to start to recognize these mathematical strengths in ourselves. One thing that we'll talk about later on this semester is math anxiety, and how sometimes we carry that ourselves because we weren't good at math when we were younger, or we struggled with it, or different things like that. And regardless if you feel that way or not, you also possess different mathematical strengths that you need to recognize so that you can also bring this confidence to the classroom, and then you can then pass on that confidence to your students. And that's, again, leads me to that second point, to exude confidence in a can do problem solving approach. And part of this, it's really important what we say as educators. So we don't want to focus on what students didn't do well. For example, we want to avoid saying things like, oh, you didn't pass that fractions test, or I think you need more practice with your multiplication facts. Instead, you could say things like, here's something I find helpful when I get stuck, or let's try this problem together and explore some ideas. So it's not about pointing out the weaknesses, but it's rather about pointing out the strengths so that you can help the student overcome what the weaknesses are. And finally, remember that all students need to know they are brilliant and capable of learning mathematical concepts and procedures, right? That confidence piece here is so important. One practical thing I can offer that really helps key into students' different strengths is this type of thought problem called which one doesn't belong. And I learned about this at a math conference that I attended. And the premise behind this is if you can Google search which one doesn't belong, or WODB, and lots of different images are going to pop up with usually four different items. And the thing that you ask students is exactly the question on the screen, which one doesn't belong? And what I love about this type of problem is that there is no one correct answer. And so it's really giving students the freedom to think their own thoughts, but also to come up with an answer that's most likely going to be successful because there are multiple correct ones. So, for example, here I just have four donuts in this picture. There are a few different things I could say. First, the top right one doesn't belong because it's a filled donut, but all the other donuts are round donuts with holes in them. I could also say that the top left one doesn't belong because it's a cake donut and all the other donuts are yeasted donuts. Or I could say that the top left one also doesn't belong because there's no frosting on it. We could also say the bottom right one doesn't belong because it has no chocolate on it, etc. And I think you guys kind of get the point here, that this is a really great activity to kind of foster that strength-based approach in your students because it gives them the freedom to think through something critically without fear of getting something wrong. Now, if you think about it, math itself does not change, but if you look at how math is being taught now in elementary schools as compared to how math was being taught when you were in elementary school, or even when your parents were in elementary school, we can really see that there has been lots of changes in the way that math has been taught, right? So the math itself hasn't changed, but the way that math is being taught is changing. And there are a few reasons why. First is because the world itself is changing, right? There's a lot of globalization, which has created a need for people to have skills that are long lasting and will survive the test of time. Also, we know that technology is really booming in today's society, and the digital world that we live in, it runs on algorithms, right? Even AI is run on an algorithm, or the advertisements that you see if you're ever on social media, all those things are centered on different mathematical algorithms. And so the need for math competency here is really so high. but there is a skills gap of qualified people. Right, and in fact, it's been predicted that in 2025, the U.S. will need to fill 3.5 million STEM jobs, right, which is kind of hard to fathom, right? But we've seen this in other fields too, right? That doctors, for example, don't use the same techniques or the same medicines that they were using even when you were a child. And so we've seen that the way that we approach and teach mathematics, it continues to evolve because we learn more about how the mind functions and how students learn. And this impacts the way we approach instruction. All right, and in particular, the research that has been done has led to a lot of the changes we've seen recently. And if you think about different organizations that we can trust, right, there is different groups, right, different experts that provide knowledge and that gives us that guide for teaching. And the group that we will reference a lot, I'm sure you guys are already familiar, is the NCTM, which is the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, and it's the major professional organization for mathematics teachers. So, in terms of research, one of the factors that's shaping what math education looks like is the public or political pressure for change, due largely to student performance results in national and international studies. And so, what exactly are these assessments showing? Well, there's an assessment called the National Assessment of Education Progress, which is short NAEP. This was done in 2019, and that assessment showed that less than half of all U.S. students in grades 4 through 8 performed at the desirable levels of proficient and advanced. Right, less than half. In particular, that was 41% of all U.S. students in grade 4 were at proficient and advanced, and then only 34% of students in grade 8 were performing at the proficient or the advanced level. There's another assessment that was done, another study. It's the also in 2019. It's the TIMSS, that stands for Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study, and this tests for fourth grade, eighth grade, and 12th grade students in over 57 countries. And we found that American students performed above the international average. However, they were outperformed at fourth grade by 14 countries. Some of those countries include Singapore, Korea, China, Japan, Ireland, Finland, and England. And that leads us to asking the question, well, why did 14 countries outperform the United States? And upon further study, upon further research, it was found that the lesson structure was starkly different. The U.S. teaching of math has largely been the same as it was 100 years ago, while other countries use numerous methods that stress active student problem solving and conceptual understanding, right? And so from this, right, we as a country realized, okay, well, we need to start making some changes. So after reviewing those studies, one of the changes or one thing that was implemented to start to promote positive change was the use of standards. And so there are content standards which articulate what critical math content students need to learn in a given grade, but not how to teach that content. So standards are not curriculum, however, right? So they just say these are the ideas, the skills that students need to have, but they don't set forth ways for teachers to teach them, right? That's still left up to the teacher. Now, there are larger groups of related standards. Those are called domains. And so anytime you see that CCSS-M, anytime you're looking at a content standard, that's referring to the domain. And in the graphic here, you see that there are 11 different domains addressed in grades K through 8. And those are what you see in the white rectangle. So counting and cardinality, operations and algebraic thinking, number and base and operations in base 10, measurement and data, geometry, expressions and equations, the number system, statistics and probability, number and operations fractions, rations and proportional relationships, and then functions. And one term that you'll hear from time to time is the term vertical alignment. And we must consider vertical alignment and learning progressions as you plan lessons. Well, what in the world does that mean? When we say vertical alignment, we really are talking about how, let me get the laser pointer on. We're talking about how all of these standards or these domain groupings overlap when it comes to all these grade levels. And what this shows is that really there's a trajectory for learning, right? We know that math concepts build off of each other. And so when we need to consider the vertical alignment, that means we have to think about what our students already know. And we also need to think about what they will need to know in the future so that we can adequately prepare them with the prerequisite knowledge to be successful in a future domain. And so the overall sequence of learning goals and the standards that guide these goals created or leads to these learning progressions. Now, I know you've all worked with standards already here through going through the education program, but what do they really mean? If we're honest, I think we all know that whenever we read a standard, they're very wordy, right? They're very educational sounding. They have a lot of verbiage to them. They're not really short, sweet, and to the point. And so, one thing that we have to ensure as educators is that we understand what the standards are that we are working with, the standards that we need to present to different students. So, let's kind of break down this standard for a second together. So here's an example. So this is the Common Core State Standard for math. It says represent a fraction 1 over b on a number line diagram by defining the interval from 0 to 1 as the whole and partitioning it into b equal parts. Recognize that each part has size 1 over b and that the endpoint of the part based at 0 locates the number 1 over b on the number line. Now, again, super wordy, can kind of sound confusing. And so there are a couple of tips that the textbook provides to help you with understanding, really decomposing, breaking down the standards. Firstly, is to look at them with your colleagues, right? A lot of you who will be teaching in elementary school, you might have a team that you're working with, like a second grade team or a third grade team. And so, really, just to look at those standards with one another to help each other understand. And the second tip they provide is to think about it with a model or to draw it out. And so let's think about how we would represent this content standard with a model. And so if we read back through, it says represent a fraction 1 over b on a number line, right? So I know I can draw a number line. It defines the interval from 0 to 1 as the whole, right? So here's our number line. We got 0, we got 1. Right, so that's kind of comparing this to the whole. Right. And then it also says partitioning that interval into b equal parts. We recognize that each part has size 1 over b and that the endpoint of the part based at 0 locates the number 1 over b on the number line. Right. So additionally, and you might see the graphic in your textbook. Right. But I could also tack this on, right? Like if I'm working with fractions, that would be 1 over b, 2 over b, 3 over b, 4 over b, etc. So again, work on the content standards with your colleagues, making sure you understand them, but also lean into different diagrams or models to help with understanding. Taking a look at the right-hand side of the slide here, we talked about how as a result of those studies that were done, these standards were developed, content standards, which again presented those different domains of information that students are required to know. But the NCTM also came up with 8 standards for mathematical practice and what K through 8 students should be able to do. So these don't necessarily align to a specific domain, but it's rather a skill set that students should be able to demonstrate regardless of what grade level they're in and what particular content they're learning. And so number 1 is to make sense of problems and to persevere in solving them. Number 2 is to reason abstractly and quantitatively. Number 3 is to construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. Number 4 is to model with mathematics. Number 5 is to use appropriate tools strategically. Number 6 is to attend to precision. Number 7, to look for and make use of structure. And number 8, to look for and express regularity in repeated reasoning. Right? And you can see even, for example, with standard number 4, like to model with mathematics, you can see how that really comes into play across multiple domains and across multiple grade levels. So again, in addition to saying this is what the students should know, this presents us with this is what the students should be able to do in their quest to learn. Now, moving on to the left-hand side, the NCTM also provided 5 process standards and how teachers can encourage them. And so these are kind of general categories or these process standards for what skills, again, teachers need to encourage. So 1 is problem solving, 2, reasoning and proof, communication, being able to make connections, and then knowing that things come in multiple representations. And so a couple questions for you to think about here in red. Which of these processes and practices did you engage in the most as K through 12 students? And maybe which ones did you engage in the least? What I can recall is I definitely, when I was young, in elementary school, we definitely modeled with mathematics. I remember using base 10 blocks, pattern blocks, different things like that. Something that we didn't really do a lot was, I don't really remember communicating a lot about the different math that we were going through, or even something like number 3 from the right-hand side, being able to construct a viable argument. And then just another question, what is one process you particularly want to encourage in your classroom, and how will you do it? So feel free to reflect on those and then continue on when you're ready. Now, in addition to those standards that we saw on the previous slide, there are also 6 guiding principles that need to be enacted in a school environment that will lead to high quality math instruction. And so as we go through these, we're going to go through each one individually as well. But these are more so, again, for the school environment and for the professionals who are working in the school. So again, we have those content standards, what the students should be learning. We saw the process standards on the previous page, the skills they should have. And now we have these guiding principles that are more so for us as professionals. So the first is teaching and learning. The second, access and equity. The third, curriculum. The fourth, tools and technology. The fifth, assessment. And then the sixth, professionalism. And there's more information on these principles if you go to the NCTM website. So now we're going to look at each individually. So the first principle is the teaching and learning principle. And for this, an excellent mathematics program requires effective teaching that engages students in meaningful learning through individual and collaborative experiences that promote their ability to make sense of mathematical ideas and reason mathematically. Now, what specific types of teacher actions support this that we see above? One thing that we can do to promote this teaching and learning principle is to ask meaningful questions and to stimulate deeper thinking. This includes ways for students to provide evidence of their thinking, like having a discussion in class, or maybe making them draw a picture to illustrate what they did to solve a problem, and even handwriting out responses if that's appropriate to your grade level, right? And the way that we ask questions is really important, right? It's almost like we want to lead with more open-ended questions, like, can you explain to me why you did that? Or can you explain to me your strategy, right? Not just asking yes or no questions, right? Facilitating good math discourse about important ideas. And as we do this, it's really important that we not only present, but encourage a variety of ways of representing important concepts. The second principle is the access and equity principle. So an excellent mathematics program requires that all students have access to high quality mathematics curriculum, effective teaching and learning, high expectations, and the support and resources needed to maximize their learning potential. So to help with this, we need to identify obstacles in student success and find ways to bridge or eliminate those barriers. For example, you might have a student that doesn't have Wi-Fi at home. And so how can we as the educator provide an accommodation that allows the student to have the same access to the learning? That might be providing supports targeted to student-specific needs. And notice how the word here on the slide is equity, not equality. So that means that different students might need different things to succeed, and we're able to provide them those different things. It doesn't mean that we give every student the same exact thing, but that just means that we're giving students what they need in order to succeed, and that could be different for different students. The next principle is curriculum. An excellent mathematics program includes curriculum that develops important mathematics along coherent learning progressions and develops connections among areas of mathematical study and between mathematics and the real world. So now, what factors influence the curriculum you will follow? That depends. If you are in a public school setting, your curriculum will most likely be presented to you. If you're in a private school setting, also your curriculum might be presented to you, and you just have to follow it. But you might be at a different type of school or in a different school setting where you have more say in your curriculum. Right? But regardless, it's important that we have some sort of curriculum that we are following, right? So that we are ensuring that there is that progression, that we're going off the standards, and that the learning that we're helping our students to do does span beyond math and kind of connects them to the real world. The next principle is tools and technology. An excellent mathematics program integrates the use of mathematical tools and technology as essential resources to help students learn and make sense of mathematical ideas, reason mathematically, and communicate their mathematical thinking. How might you employ technology to enhance the learning of mathematics in your classroom? Now, there's tons of different answers to this, but I encourage you to think beyond computation. So not just drill and practice, like using digital flashcards online through a website like Quizlet, but even using something like a physical virtual manipulative to help your students gain conceptual understanding. So just kind of branch out and feel free to be creative with this principle. The next principle is assessment. An excellent mathematics program ensures that assessment is an integral part of instruction and informs feedback to students, instructional decisions, and program improvement. Now, what are some examples of effective assessment practices you will employ in your classroom? As you think about that, I want to remind you that there are multiple forms or different kinds of assessment. We know that there's formative assessment, which is a range of formal and informal assessment procedures conducted by teachers during the learning process in order to modify teaching and learning activities to improve student attainment. It typically involves qualitative feedback rather than scores for both the student and the teacher that focuses on the details of content and performance. We also know then that there's summative assessment, which seeks to monitor educational outcomes, often for purposes of external accountability. This encourages self-assessment and students checking their own work. Now, if you are someone who kind of confuses what these two types of assessment are or what they mean, how I usually like to remember it is if in a summative assessment, which again seeks to monitor the outcomes, it kind of looks like the word summary. And if you think about a summary, like of a book, it's kind of like a synopsis of the whole book. And so a summative assessment, right, it's an indicator or kind of like a summary of what a student knows. So I usually think about it that way. And then formative assessment, I see the word form in there. And so it's the type of assessments that you give, both formal and informal, while a student's knowledge is still being formed. So it's kind of all the things along the way. Now, in order for any assessment to be effective, teachers must use a variety of assessment techniques. They also must understand their mathematics goals deeply and have a research supported notion of students' thinking or common misunderstandings. Right? So there's lots involved here with this assessment principle. Now, the last principle is professionalism. In an excellent mathematics program, educators hold themselves and their colleagues accountable for the mathematical success of every student and for their personal and collective professional growth toward effective teaching and learning of mathematics. So, what actions will you take to enhance your professionalism as a math teacher? So, there are a few things I can offer you here. I encourage you to take advantage of mentorship from colleagues and professional development opportunities. For example, your school might offer to send you to a specific conference for your content or for an educators conference. Those are also always good to attend. Pursuing higher education or a higher degree also falls into this professionalism principle, but also always structure in time to reflect on and to analyze your instructional practices. We know that that's kind of a built-in part of our lesson planning template here at Franciscan. We know we don't always fill that out because it's meant to be done after a lesson is taught, But we all should be believing in lifelong learning, and as educators, reflection and what we've done that's well and what we've done that needs worked on is all part of that. So, what characteristics do you need to be an effective math teacher? First and foremost, your knowledge of mathematics should be profound, flexible, and adaptive. You should be persistent so that you can stave off frustration and show an example of persistence to your students. You should have a positive attitude. We've talked about how some students are just already negatively disposed to mathematics, and so you having a positive attitude will make it easier to change their attitudes towards mathematics. You should have a readiness for change, the ability to be flexible. This includes being able to unlearn and relearn certain mathematical concepts, especially those that are being taught differently now as compared to when you were in school. You should have a willingness to be a team player. This could mean amongst your team of other teachers. This could mean amongst your district with your administration. Being able to use the same language, symbols, models, and notation as those you work most closely with. And you should also be reflective and self-aware. That includes the need for growth and for development. And some of you might have heard about the growth mindset before by Carol Dweck. And I think persistence and a positive attitude are foundational to developing that growth mindset. Carol Dweck, if you've never heard of her, she's a famous Ivy League trained educational psychologist and has spent a lot of her life researching student motivation. And through her research, she has found that students position themselves somewhere on a continuum from fixed mindset to growth mindset. In a fixed mindset, students believe their basic abilities, their intelligence, their talents are just fixed traits. They have a certain amount, and that's that. And then their goal becomes to look smart all the time and never look dumb. In a growth mindset, students understand that their talents and abilities can be developed through effort, good teaching, and persistence. They don't necessarily think everyone's the same or anyone can be Einstein, but they believe everyone can get smarter if they work at it. This is essentially important because individuals with a growth theory are more likely to continue working hard despite setbacks, and individuals' theories of intelligence can be affected by subtle environmental cues. For example, children given praise such as "good job, you're very smart" are much more likely to develop a fixed mindset. Whereas if given compliments like "good job, you worked very hard," they are likely to develop a growth mindset. And so we've mentioned already in this video about how even the types of questions we ask students are so important. Right? It's really important that we're giving compliments that lead our students to have this growth mindset because it really is a skill. And so, in other words, it is possible to encourage students to persist despite failure by encouraging them to think about learning in a certain way. Persistence and a positive disposition are traits of a growth mindset. Now, to end, I want to leave you with this quote from St. Francis de Sales because a lot of the time we think about helping our students to develop a growth mindset, but it's even more so important for us as teachers to develop this growth mindset. I know that, you'll learn next week that I am a high school math teacher, but those of you who are going into elementary, and even those of you doing middle school licensure, you guys are responsible for multiple subjects at once, right? Middle school, you might be responsible for 2 or 3. Elementary teachers, you guys are going to be responsible for teaching all the subjects. And often, because of that, if we have our own insecurities about math, that kind of gets carried into the way that we teach the math. And one of my goals for you this semester is for you to build your own confidence in mathematics because that's going to help you teach your students confidently, but also help them grow their confidence levels even more. And so, as we work through the semester talking about growth mindset for our students, I also want you to have a growth mindset with yourself, right? To know that maybe you were not the best math student when you were younger, but that doesn't mean that you can't be a good math teacher today. And so, St. Francis de Sales' quote here, I think, kind of summarizes that really well. So it says, "Have patience with all things, but first with yourself. Never confuse your mistakes with your value as a human being." Right? And just from my experience, you are going to make a mistake as a teacher. It's going to happen. You're going to make multiple. I make multiple mistakes. I still make mistakes. But what's important is that we continue to learn from them and that we're gentle with ourselves, because we really do have a calling, right? Being a teacher, it's a vocation with a little v in a sense. And so know that God has ordained you to do that. And because of that, we need to lean into his grace, even when we make mistakes ourselves. So remember to complete the tasks I showed at the beginning of the video, including the quiz, and I look forward to meeting you all next week. Take care.